In a dramatic legal showdown that has captured national attention and sent shockwaves through the political landscape, a U.S. district judge has temporarily blocked President Trump's controversial plan to deploy Oregon's National Guard to Portland, a city already on edge from weeks of unrest and protest. Judge Karen Immergut, herself a Trump appointee, issued a 14-day restraining order late last night, halting the deployment of 200 Guard members. This decision hands Oregon officials a significant, if temporary, victory in their ongoing battle with the federal government over control and authority. At the heart of the dispute is a fundamental constitutional question. Who has the ultimate authority to control the National Guard for domestic law enforcement? The President of the United States or the Governor of the state? Oregon's leaders, including Governor Kate Brown, argue that the president's move is not only unprecedented but also unconstitutional, violating the state's rights and the principle of federalism. Meanwhile, the Trump administration insists that deploying the Guard is necessary to protect federal property and restore order, especially as protests have at times turned violent and destructive. The federal government responded swiftly and defiantly, immediately appealing Judge Immergut's order to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and seeking an emergency stay. However, Judge Immergut denied the request, keeping the restraining order in place for now. This legal standoff has left the fate of the National Guard deployment and the delicate balance of power between state and federal government in a state of uncertainty, with both sides digging in for a prolonged fight. The case has reignited a fierce national debate over federalism, the limits of presidential authority, and the rights of states to govern their own affairs without federal interference. As the legal battle continues, all eyes are on the courts. The coming days will determine whether this judicial block holds firm or crumbles under mounting federal pressure, setting a precedent for future conflicts between state and federal power. The conflict that would soon grip Portland began with a single social media post, quickly gaining traction and sparking heated debate online. As images and videos of protests circulated, the nation's attention turned to Oregon, where tensions were already running high. President Trump seized on the moment, announcing that he would send federal troops to what he described as war-ravaged Portland. His words echoed across news outlets and social media, amplifying the sense of crisis and urgency. He directed Secretary of War Pete Hegseth to federalize 200 Oregon National Guard members for a 60-day deployment, a move that overrode the strong objections of Oregon's governor, Tina Kotek. The decision was made swiftly, leaving state officials scrambling to respond. Normally, a state's National Guard answers to its governor, not the president. Federalizing them over the explicit protest of state leadership is both rare and legally fraught, raising questions about the limits of executive power and the balance between state and federal authority. The Trump administration justified its extraordinary intervention by claiming that ongoing unrest in Portland posed a direct threat to federal facilities, especially the ICE building. Officials argued that only a strong federal response could restore order and protect government property. By labeling protesters as domestic terrorists, the White House sought to frame Portland as a city spiraling out of control. This narrative was pushed not only to the public, but also to the courts, aiming to justify the use of federal force under extraordinary circumstances. Local officials, however, fiercely disputed this characterization. They argued that the majority of protests were peaceful, and that the president's move was less about public safety and more about political theater in an election year. The deployment of the National Guard to Portland quickly became a direct test of presidential power under the Insurrection Act, a rarely used law that allows the president to deploy military forces within the United States in times of crisis. Oregon's leaders refused to back down, vowing to challenge the federal action in court. Their resistance set the stage for a high-stakes legal and political battle, one that would have implications far beyond the streets of Portland. Oregon's leaders responded swiftly, determined to protect the state's autonomy in the face of federal intervention. Within hours of the president's announcement, top officials convened emergency meetings, consulting with legal experts and state agencies to chart a path forward. The sense of urgency was palpable, as the stakes involved not just public safety, but the very principle of state self-governance. Acting decisively, Oregon filed a federal lawsuit to block the deployment of the National Guard, seeking immediate judicial intervention to halt what they saw as an overreach of executive power. In their legal brief, state attorneys argued that the president's order was unconstitutional, lacking any legitimate legal basis to federalize the Guard without the governor's explicit consent. They cited both the U.S. Constitution and long-standing legal precedent, emphasizing the importance of checks and balances between state and federal governments. State attorneys painted a very different picture from the one described by the White House. Protests in Portland had dwindled to small, peaceful gatherings, easily managed by local authorities. The narrative of chaos and disorder, they argued, was exaggerated, and did not reflect the reality on the ground. Forcibly activating the Guard, they warned, would not only undermine state authority, but also disrupt ongoing emergency preparedness efforts and risk escalating tensions in communities that were already working toward calm and resolution. The lawsuit cautioned that allowing such federal overreach would set a dangerous precedent, eroding the boundaries of local control and blurring the vital lines between military and civilian authority. It was a warning about the long-term consequences for American democracy. Oregon's message was clear and unwavering. The state would not allow its authority to be commandeered for political purposes, nor would it stand by while its constitutional rights were threatened. Ultimately, the legal fight was about more than just the events in Portland. It was a defense of federalism itself, and a stand for the enduring balance of power between state and federal governments. Judge Immergut's ruling was a sharp rebuke of the Trump administration's claims. She found the president likely exceeded his authority, noting the administration's narrative of daily unrest was unsupported by facts. Federal law, she wrote, allows federalizing the Guard only in extreme cases, like invasion or insurrection, not for small, manageable protests. Her decision underscored, "This is a nation of constitutional law, not martial law." The judge concluded the president's order likely violated the 10th Amendment, infringing on Oregon's right to control its own Guard. As a Trump appointee, her ruling carried extra weight, making it harder to dismiss as partisan. The order was more than a procedural delay, it was a fundamental critique of executive overreach. At the heart of the legal fight are two competing realities. The Trump administration painted Portland as a city in chaos, citing summer protests and threats to federal property. But by late September, local officials and reporters described small, sporadic gatherings, often fewer than 24 people. State evidence showed the daily unrest was exaggerated, and local police had things under control. Deploying 200 Guard troops, they argued, would escalate tensions and provoke larger confrontations. For most Portlanders, daily life was normal, far from the war zone described by Washington. The disconnect between political rhetoric and on-the-ground reality was central to the court's decision. The court's role as fact-finder became crucial in cutting through the noise. The Trump administration defended its actions, insisting the president has a duty to protect federal assets and personnel. White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson argued the deployment was necessary to counter violent riots and attacks on law enforcement. The Justice Department claimed the president's judgment in national security matters deserves deference, even for small-scale unrest. Administration lawyers argued the president can act preventatively, not just reactively, to threats. They maintained the president has inherent authority to enforce federal law, even over a governor's objections. Confident in their legal footing, the administration appealed to the Ninth Circuit, expecting the restraining order to be overturned. The next phase of the legal battle would test the limits of executive power. The court's decision drew immediate praise from civil liberties groups, legal experts, and local officials. The ACLU of Oregon called the ruling a vital check on presidential power, warning that federalizing the Guard threatened to militarize communities. Critics also highlighted the $10 million cost of the deployment, calling it a waste of public funds. Oregon's leaders presented a united front, insisting they were best equipped to manage public safety. They saw the federal intervention as a politically motivated intrusion that risked making things worse. The Portland case became a bellwether for federal-local relations nationwide. Judge Immergut's ruling was seen as a necessary reaffirmation of constitutional limits on presidential authority. The Portland case is more than a local dispute. It's a national test of presidential power versus state and local authority. The outcome could set a precedent for future federal interventions in American cities. The Ninth Circuit's decision will determine whether the president can override governors to deploy troops for law enforcement. If the court sides with the White House, it could embolden similar actions elsewhere, reshaping federal-local dynamics. If the restraining order stands, it will reinforce the principle that deploying troops domestically is an extraordinary measure, not a political tool. The legal battle has crystallized a fundamental debate about American governance. The fate of 200 Guard members and the balance of power in the nation hangs in the balance.